Major Tom Archer had always been fascinated by ancient history, spending hours poring over books on ancient battles, from the Spartan stand at Thermopylae to Hannibal's brilliant maneuvering at Cannae. Now, as a military strategist for the Allied forces during World War II, he saw patterns from those dusty histories woven into the complex theater of modern war. It was a bitterly cold December night in 1944. And Archer was stationed in a small, makeshift headquarters on the edge of the Ardennes. A map of the region lay sprawled across the table, dotted with tiny markers for each division, tank battalion, and artillery unit. As he studied it, he felt an uncanny sense of familiarity, as though he were peering through time itself, tracing a lineage that connected his battlefield to those fought millennia ago. Chapter 1. The Shield Wall and the Phalanx. Archer's thoughts drifted back to ancient Greece, where the phalanx, an impenetrable wall of soldiers armed with long spears, had reigned supreme. The tactic, perfected by the Spartans and later the Macedonians, relied on soldiers working together in close ranks, creating an unbreakable line. Though tanks, artillery, and planes had transformed warfare, Archer noticed that the principle of unified, tightly coordinated defense hadn't changed. The Ardennes offensive, unfolding all around him, was a struggle for stronghold positions that mirrored the Greeks' reliance on holding and advancing in powerful formations. The tanks rolling across the fields were, in essence, a modern-day phalanx, providing cover for advancing troops and breaking enemy lines just as the Greeks had done centuries earlier. Archer's own strategy for the Allied defense relied on creating a unified front, similar to the phalanxes of old. If his lines were too thin, they'd be broken by the Germans, who would pour through any gap, just as Alexander had crushed the Persian defenses by finding their weak points. Chapter 2. Hannibal's Double Envelopment. The Ardennes was not Archer's first deployment. He had served on the front lines in North Africa, where the Allies faced off against General Rommel, the Desert Fox. There, Archer had seen one of the greatest military strategies in action, a modern version of Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal had surrounded the much larger Roman army on all sides, trapping them in a deadly circle. The result was a massacre, one of the worst losses in Roman history. Rommel, too, had learned this lesson well, using his tanks to perform swift, encircling maneuvers that left Allied forces cut off from their supply lines. One fateful day in 1942, Archer watched as Rommel's forces closed in, surrounding Allied troops in the searing heat of the North African desert. He realized that despite centuries of military evolution, the concept of envelopment, the ability to encircle and crush, remained as deadly as ever. The only way to escape, Archer had learned, was to keep moving, to stay unpredictable, and to look for weak spots in the encircling forces. It was a lesson Hannibal would have understood all too well. Chapter 3. Psychological Warfare and the Siege. By the winter of 1943, Archer had been reassigned to Italy, where he witnessed the full power of another ancient tactic, psychological warfare and the siege. The Romans had been masters of this, using long sieges to starve out their enemies, demoralizing them until surrender was the only option. The Roman siege at Alesia, where Caesar encircled and defeated the Gallic forces, was a masterpiece of psychological and strategic warfare. In Italy, the Allied forces used similar tactics, launching extensive bombing campaigns and cutting off supply routes to weaken German forces entrenched in fortified positions. The months wore on, and as supplies dwindled, Archer could see the enemy's morale breaking under the strain. Psychological warfare, fear, hunger, exhaustion, was proving as effective in the 20th century as it had in ancient Rome. The battlefield changed, but human psychology remained the same. As the German resistance weakened, Archer reflected on Caesar's campaigns. A siege was more than just a military maneuver. It was a test of willpower, patience, and endurance. Watching the enemy's spirit wane, he understood that warfare was often more about breaking minds than bodies. Chapter 4. The Scorched Earth Policy. Archer's next post was in Eastern Europe, where he witnessed the devastation of the Scorched Earth Policy, a tactic used to deny the enemy resources. He thought back to the Russians' Scorched Earth retreat against Napoleon, and even further back to the Scythians, who had torched their own lands to keep the Persians at bay. The Russians, facing the German invasion, had employed the same strategy: villages burned, fields destroyed, and supplies withdrawn as the Red Army retreated deeper into the Soviet Union. The Germans found themselves stranded in a wasteland, their supply lines stretched thin and their morale flagging. The principle was ancient, but brutally effective. Archer noted how the tactic had evolved from flaming fields to demolished railways and bombed bridges. The destruction left the Germans vulnerable, turning the brutal Russian winter into an ally for the Soviet forces. As he moved through the desolate landscape, he marveled at how timeless this tactic was, how the denial of resources could be as powerful as any weapon. Chapter 5. Guerrilla Warfare and the Spirit of the Resistance. In 1944, Archer was sent to France to assist the local resistance. Here he saw ancient guerrilla tactics come to life, the spirit of revolt passed down from small bands of fighters in ancient lands. Guerrilla warfare had been used by countless groups throughout history. The Celts resisting the Romans, the Spanish fighting Napoleon, and now the French against Nazi occupation. The French resistance fighters reminded him of ancient warriors who harassed, ambushed, and sabotaged. They fought in forests, attacked supply lines, and disappeared back into the countryside. The method was as old as warfare itself, unconventional, adaptable, and born of a fierce desire to defend one's homeland. Working with the resistance, Archer learned the power of unconventional warfare. It wasn't about the number of troops or firepower. It was about cunning, stealth, and the ability to outmaneuver. The French fighters were like ancient guerrilla warriors, carrying on a legacy that was both ancient and eternal. Epilogue. Reflections on the legacy. By the time the war ended, Archer felt that he had been part of something far larger than himself or even his generation. The strategies of the ancients, phalanxes, sieges, envelopment, and guerrilla warfare, were not relics of the past, but living, breathing tactics that had shaped battles and lives across millennia. Back home, as Archer sat by the fire with a well-worn book on ancient battles, he pondered the connections he had witnessed. It was as though history had looped, as if every war was a reincarnation of the last, with new weapons but the same enduring principles. Spears had become tanks, forts had become trenches, and catapults had evolved into artillery. But the tactics, the fundamental lessons, remained. "What is the true legacy of ancient warfare?" he wrote in his journal. "Is it merely the tactics, the maneuvers, the ways to win? Or is it something deeper, a testament to the resilience and creativity of the human mind, bound both by conflict and the relentless pursuit of survival?" As he put his pen down, he felt that the legacy of ancient battles was not in the blood spilled or the ground gained, but in the resilience of the strategies themselves. The warriors of the past lived on, not in marble statues or faded manuscripts, but in the very tactics that had once again brought victory at great cost to those who fought in the modern age. For as long as humanity waged war, Archer knew, the ancient lessons would endure, etched not only in history, but in the hearts and minds of those who continued to fight, from spears to tanks, from past to future. And perhaps, he thought with a glimmer of hope, one day these lessons would help humanity find a path to peace rather than victory.